Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into something pretty important. We're talking about fairness in tests today,
Oh, yeah, it's a big one.
using some really insightful excerpts from a chapter on testing by Dr. Salkind.
I've read some of his work. It's really
That's
interesting.
like a leading expert in the field.
Mm,
And, it's a topic that I think a lot of people have strong feelings about.
yeah, burger
So,
fan.
so today we're going to be exploring test bias, universal design, and what it takes to create like truly fair assessments.
I think his work is really important, especially the stuff about the subtle ways that bias can like creep into tests
Yeah.
and how these design choices can actually have like a huge impact on students' lives.
That's exactly what makes this deep dive so important, right? I
Mhm.
mean, think about it. Tests are everywhere.
They really are.
They have a huge impact, like college admissions, job placements, even things like driver's licenses.
Yeah, you can't really get around them.
It's all determined by tests, but what happens when those tests aren't fair?
Right. That's a major
That's
problem.
what we're looking at.
Yeah, when a test is biased, it's not accurately measuring what it's supposed to.
Right.
So the results can be super misleading and then lead to, unfair decisions and stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of break down Salking's definition of test bias.
Okay.
He gives this example of a math test where males and females score differently, even though they have like the same math ability.
Right.
So what's going on there?
Well, he argues that the test itself might be unintentionally measuring something else,
Oh,
like cultural background or exposure to certain types of math problems rather than actual math ability.
interesting.
So it's not just about scores being different, it's about why they're different.
Okay.
And if those differences actually reflect real variations in the skill that you're trying to assess.
So it's like the test is measuring the wrong thing,
Yeah.
and it gives like a distorted picture of the student's ability.
Exactly. And that's where the whole, test bias versus test fairness distinction comes in,
Right.
which Salking really emphasizes. Test bias is something you can measure, but test fairness is more about values and judgment.
Okay.
It goes beyond just identifying bias and makes you ask how are these scores actually being used?
Interesting.
And what are the consequences of, how you interpret them?
So a test might be unbiased, like the test itself,
Yeah.
but then the way those scores are used could still be like ethically problematic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he uses this great example about college admissions.
Okay.
So let's say a college uses SAT scores, extracurriculars, and even financial ability to decide who gets admitted.
Mm,
The weight that they give to each of those factors reflects their values.
right.
They might say, okay, SAT scores are important, but they only count for 25% of the decision.
Okay.
But why 25? Why not more? Why not less?
Yeah.
These are all based on judgments about what they think is important in a student.
Right. It's not like a neutral decision.
No, not at all. It's about what they value.
Yeah. It really highlights the power dynamics there.
Definitely.
It's not just about numbers. It's about how people in power are interpreting those numbers.
Yeah.
And then using them to like make decisions about people's futures.
Right. And, that's what he calls consequential validity.
Okay.
What's the real impact of these scores? Are they opening doors or are they closing doors?
Hmm.
And that's where organizations like Fair Test come in.
Yeah.
They advocate for, more equitable testing practices.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard of fair test.
Yeah. They're all about kind of shining a light on how standardized testing can be flawed and misused.
Yeah, and I was struck by their like 5 core principles,
Yeah.
particularly this idea that we shouldn't rely just on one test
Right.
and that we need to use multiple types of assessments and
Yeah.
consider the broader context of a student's learning journey.
They basically say that a single test score can't really tell you the whole story about a person's abilities and their potential.
Right, it's too narrow.
Yeah, and people learn and demonstrate knowledge in different ways.
Yeah.
So relying on these standardized tests can lead to unfair and inaccurate judgments.
Like judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
Exactly. So how do we go about identifying potential bias in tests? Well, Salking outlines these 3 key models. The first one is called the difference bias model.
Difference.
Again, it basically focuses on, comparing performance between different groups.
Okay, so like comparing how boys score versus girls or something.
Right, exactly. But, just because there's a difference in scores doesn't automatically mean there's bias, right?
Maybe we talked about that.
We have to look deeper
Yeah.
and figure out why those differences exist.
Is it a real difference or something else going on?
Exactly.
Okay.
Take the gender gap in math scores that Salking talked about.
Mm-hmm.
This model would just highlight that gap.
Okay.
But it wouldn't tell us, is it due to inherent differences in mathematical ability?
Interesting.
Or is it because the test itself, or maybe even societal expectations, like favor boys over girls?
Right. Like, are girls getting the same opportunities to develop those skills?
Exactly. And there are so many other factors too, right? Like cultural background, learning styles, even access to quality education.
All that stuff can influence how someone performs on a test.
Absolutely. So
Right.
we have to go beyond just noticing these score differences and really understand those factors.
You dig deeper.
Exactly. And another model that he talked about is the item by item approach.
Okay, item by item, what is that one?
That's where we actually look at the test questions themselves,
Oh, okay.
trying to spot individual questions that might be tripping up certain groups more than others.
Okay, so like looking for the questions that are biased.
Right, and it uses something called differential item functioning,
Okay.
or DIF.
DIF.
It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple, really.
Okay.
It basically examines whether certain questions are harder for one group than another, even if they have the same overall ability level.
Okay, so give me an example.
Okay, so let's say you have two students, right? One male, one female, and they have similar overall scores on this math test.
Okay, similar abilities.
Right, but they consistently perform differently on one specific question.
Okay, what would that tell us?
That's a red flag. It suggests that maybe that question is tapping into something other than the intended math skill.
Oh.
So it could be revealing some bias.
Okay.
Like maybe the wording is confusing for one group, or the content relies on knowledge that one group is more likely to have.
So instead of measuring math ability,
Yeah.
that question might be accidentally measuring something else, like cultural background.
Exactly. And that's why this DIF analysis can be so useful.
Right.
It can help pinpoint those specific problem areas within a test.
So they can fix it.
Yeah, you can refine the questions or even get rid of them entirely
Okay.
to improve the fairness of the test.
That's cool. It's like you're doing this microscopic examination of the test,
Yeah,
looking for these tiny little cracks that could be creating an uneven playing field.
I like that analogy.
Thanks.
And, this focus on the content of the questions really ties into the third model. He talks about the on the face of things model, which is all about content validity.
Right. We talked about content validity in our last deep dive,
We did.
and I'm curious to see how it connects to test bias.
Well, this model is really focused on whether the test questions are actually fair representations of what they're supposed to be assessing.
Okay, so are they really measuring what they claim to measure?
Exactly. Are they accurately reflecting the knowledge or skills being tested, or are they introducing, irrelevant factors that could unfairly disadvantage certain groups?
I'm starting to see how this can be so subtle.
Yeah,
It's not always like overt discrimination.
right.
It can be these tiny little biases.
Yeah, almost invisible woven into the test.
Right.
Salkind gives some great examples, like imagine a history test that only asks about wars and political leaders,
Okay.
but it totally neglects social movements or, like the contributions of marginalized groups.
Oh, that would definitely give you a skewed perspective of history.
Exactly.
And it would disadvantage the students whose experiences don't align with that.
Right.
Okay.
Or what about a reading comprehension test that uses these really complicated vocabulary words and sentence structures
Okay.
that are more common in like academic writing
Yeah.
than in everyday language?
Well, that would put students from disadvantaged backgrounds at a disadvantage
Totally.
if they haven't had the same exposure to that kind of language.
Absolutely. They might be able to understand it if it was presented differently.
Right.
But the test format itself is like an artificial barrier.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's why we have to be mindful of these subtle biases.
It feels like we're peeling back the layers of an onion here,
I like that.
revealing these hidden assumptions and biases
Yeah.
that can shape the whole testing experience.
It is pretty unsettling when you start to think about it.
Yeah. But the good news is we can do something about it.
Absolutely.
By recognizing them, we can start to fix them.
We can create tests that are actually fair and equitable.
Okay, that's a great segue
Yeah.
into the next part of our deep dive, where we'll look at Salkind's four-step process for creating and using tests fairly, and then we'll jump into the world of universal design and adaptive testing.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned.
I'm excited. So we talked about those 3 models of test bias.
Yeah, those were fascinating.
But now I want to talk about some solutions.
Okay, let's get to that.
And I'm really intrigued by this idea of universal design that Salkind talks about.
Yeah, universal design.
What do you think about that?
I think it's a really promising idea.
Hmm?
Creating tests that work well for everyone,
Yeah,
regardless of like their background or their learning differences.
Right.
It's a big goal,
it is.
but I think it's a really important one.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of those ramps you see at building entrances.
Oh, yeah.
They were originally designed for, wheelchair accessibility,
Right.
but they end up benefiting everybody,
Yeah, for sure.
like delivery people with heavy carts or parents pushing strollers.
Exactly. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
It's not about catering to specific needs. It's about creating a design that works well for everyone.
I like that.
And Salkind draws this really interesting parallel between those accessible buildings and accessible tests. Wider hallways become ample white space on the page.
Okay.
Clear signage translates to clear typefaces and formatting.
So it's about removing those barriers.
Yeah,
And creating a smoother experience for everyone.
exactly.
Okay, I get the analogy.
Yeah.
But what are some concrete examples?
Okay.
Like how do you actually make a test universally accessible?
Well, it starts with thinking about both the mechanics of the test
Okay.
and the content.
Okay.
So something as simple as aligning the text to the left margin
Oh, okay.
can make a huge difference for readers with visual impairments.
Oh, that makes sense.
And using larger font sizes like 14-point or even bigger
Okay.
can improve readability and comprehension for everyone.
So not just for people with vision difficulties.
Right, exactly.
Wait, so bigger fonts actually lead to better scores for all students?
They do.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive.
It does.
But it makes sense if you think about the cognitive load
Right.
of trying to read this tiny cramped text.
Yeah, it's harder to focus.
Exactly. And it really highlights how these small design choices
Yeah.
can have a big impact on students' performance.
Okay.
And it goes beyond just font size.
What else?
Using plenty of white space on the page
Okay.
helps reduce visual clutter.
Right, less overwhelming.
Exactly. And that's especially helpful for students with ADHD.
Right, or learning disabilities.
Yeah. Think about how overwhelming a dense page of text can be.
Yeah, for sure.
Even for someone without those challenges.
Oh, yeah, I totally get that.
Like when I'm facing a wall of text, my brain just shuts down.
Mine too.
So yeah,
Okay.
universal design is about anticipating those barriers
Okay.
and just designing them out from the start.
Yeah.
Another key element is high contrast between the text and the background.
Okay, like black text on a white background.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's really crucial for visibility.
Makes sense.
And when it comes to illustrations,
Yeah.
Salkind suggests opting for simple, clear visuals
Okay.
that complement the text without competing for attention.
So it's all about clarity and accessibility.
Exactly.
It makes me wonder, do traditional standardized tests actually take these principles into account?
That's a good question, and unfortunately a lot of them don't. And that's why Salkind's work is so important.
Right.
He's really pushing for people to think differently about assessment design
Okay.
and to prioritize accessibility from the start.
Okay, so we've talked about the look of the test,
Right.
the mechanics,
Mechanics.
but universal design isn't just about that.
Right.
It's also about the content
It is.
and the wording of the question.
Exactly. So let's talk about that.
Okay, what are some of the key considerations there?
Well, one of the most important things is making sure that all test takers have the shared experiences and the prior knowledge,
Okay.
that they need to understand the questions.
So not relying on experiences that only certain groups would have.
Right. You don't want to ask a question that relies on knowledge that's specific to a particular culture or socioeconomic group.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's about making sure everyone's on an equal footing,
Exactly.
regardless of their background.
Right.
Okay.
It's about creating a level playing field
Yeah.
by making sure the questions tap into knowledge and skills that are universally accessible.
Okay.
Another important thing is using age-appropriate vocabulary and sentence structure.
Okay, so no throwing in big fancy words just to make the test seem harder.
Right. The goal is clarity, not confusion.
Okay.
If a sentence is too complex, break it down
Okay.
into shorter, simpler sentences,
Yeah.
even if you have to bend the rules of grammar a little bit.
So clarity is more important than formality.
Exactly. It's
Fine.
about making sure the information is clear
Yeah.
and effective.
Rather than using all these, strict writing conventions.
Yeah.
That might make it harder for some students to understand.
Exactly.
Okay. And speaking of breaking down barriers,
Yes.
there's this really cool thing called adaptive testing.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard about this.
Pretty amazing.
Isn't that where computers adjust the difficulty of the test
They do.
based on how the student is doing?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So it starts with a set of questions,
Okay.
and then based on your answers, the computer adjusts the difficulty level.
So it gives you harder or easier questions
Yeah.
depending on how you're doing.
Exactly, to try to pinpoint your specific skill level.
Okay, so if I'm acing the first few questions, it's going to start giving me harder ones to really challenge me.
Yeah, it'll throw in some curveballs.
Oh.
And if you're struggling, it might back off a bit
Okay.
and give you some more manageable questions.
It's build my confidence.
Right. And to figure out where you need more support.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's super smart.
Yeah, it sounds really responsive to the individual student.
It is.
But how does this connect back to universal design?
Good question.
I thought universal design was about like one test that works for everyone.
Right.
This sounds like a custom test for each person.
Yeah, that's a good observation.
So is it still universal design?
Well, you're right. Adaptive testing does kind of deviate from that traditional one-size-fits-all approach.
Okay.
But it still promotes fairness
Okay.
by making sure that each person is getting a testing experience that's tailored to their own ability level.
So it's like offering multiple paths to fairness.
Yeah.
Because not everyone learns the same way.
Right.
And everyone has different strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. And adaptive testing uses technology to address those variations.
Okay.
And to create a more personalized experience.
Okay.
It might not be a perfect solution,
Right.
but it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it seems like there's always this tension between standardization and personalization. In testing, like on one hand, you want a standard measure, so you can compare students fairly, but then on the other hand, you want to recognize and accommodate those individual differences.
Exactly.
And that seems like a tough balance to strike.
It is a key tension.
Yeah.
And it's something that, educators and test developers are constantly grappling with.
Right.
And it brings us back to Salkind's main argument.
Correct.
He thinks we need to shift our focus away from just identifying bias
Okay.
and start designing tests that are fair and accessible from the very beginning.
So it's not just about fixing the problems after the fact.
Right.
It's about building fairness into the DNA of the test itself.
Exactly. And that requires a pretty big shift in mindset, both in how we design tests
Right.
and how we think about, what assessment is really for.
That's a tall order, but I think it's necessary.
I agree.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
Yeah, it is.
We've covered so much.
Yeah, we have.
From defining test bias, exploring the different models for identifying it,
Right.
talking about universal design and adaptive testing.
A lot to process.
It is a lot to process.
But, I think you've done a great job synthesizing all this information.
Oh, thanks.
And it's clear that you're really passionate about this topic.
I am. It's fascinating, but it can also feel a little overwhelming.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, where do we even begin to make changes?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll look at some specific steps that individuals can take to promote fairness in assessments.
Okay. Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've explored like all these challenges
Yeah.
and potential solutions around, test fairness and design.
Yeah.
But how do we actually put this into practice?
Right.
What can we do about it?
That's the big question, isn't
Yeah.
it? It can feel a little overwhelming, to be honest,
It can.
when you think about tackling these big systemic problems,
Right.
like test bias.
Yeah. But Salkind reminds us that even small actions can make a difference.
They really can.
It all starts with awareness.
Yeah.
And a willingness to kind of challenge the status quo.
Exactly.
So where do we begin?
Well,
Salkind actually mentions some resources in the chapter that might be helpful.
Oh, yeah.
For people who want to learn more.
oh, yeah.
There's The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
Have you read that one?
I have, yeah. It's a great starting point for understanding the history of intelligence testing
Okay.
and how it's been used to, kind of perpetuate inequalities.
It's like a critique of how testing has been misused.
Yeah, definitely a must read
Okay.
if you want to really understand this field.
And he also recommends the Handbook of Accessible Instruction and Testing Practices.
No, yeah, that one's great for practical tips
Okay.
and strategies for creating, more inclusive learning environments.
I like that he gives these concrete resources.
Yeah, me too.
Makes it feel like, okay, we can actually do something.
Right, it's not just theory.
Yeah. And there's also this project that I came across called Learning for Justice.
Oh, yeah.
It's run by the Southern Poverty Law Center.
I've heard of them.
I'm familiar with their work on social justice issues,
They do great work.
but I wasn't sure how they connect to the testing world.
Well, their Learning for Justice project
Okay.
focuses specifically on, addressing bias and equity in education.
Okay.
And that includes, test fairness
Right, of course.
and advocating for, better assessment practices.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's Fair Test that we talked about earlier.
Can't forget them.
Their website is like a treasure trove of information.
It really is.
For anyone who's concerned about the impact of standardized testing.
Yeah. They have everything, reports, articles, even action guides for parents and educators who want to, make a change.
That's great.
Yeah. Fair Tests is a really important organization in this movement.
Yeah.
They provide so many resources to help people understand these issues and connect with others.
Right, and actually push for policy changes.
Exactly, yeah.
It's good to know that there are organizations out there, actually fighting for this.
Right, and giving us the tools to join in.
Yeah, and it's not just about those organizations, though.
Yeah.
It's also about personal responsibility.
Right.
Salkind talks about recognizing our own biases.
Yeah, we all have them.
And he mentions this website called Project Implicit.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
Where you can take a test.
You can.
To kind of uncover your own unconscious biases.
Those hidden biases.
Right? Have you taken it?
I have, yeah. It's really interesting.
What'd you think?
It can be a little unsettling.
Yeah.
To kind of confront those things that you might not even be aware of.
Right. We all like to think that we're not biased.
We do.
But, we all have these biases.
Yeah, we do.
Shaped by our experiences.
Right, exactly.
The messages we've received throughout our lives.
And they can really affect us. In ways that we don't realize, right?
It affects our perceptions, our interactions, even our decisions.
Especially for educators.
Yeah.
Or anyone who designs tests.
Anyone involved in assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah, self-awareness is so important.
It makes me think about that on the face of things model we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And how important it is to have diverse perspectives.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Involved in test development.
For sure.
Because if you just have a bunch of people with the same background, same experiences.
You're going to miss things.
Yeah, they might not even see the biases that are there.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have diverse teams.
Yeah.
Involved in every stage of development from the beginning to the end.
So from coming up with the questions to reviewing them to revising them.
Right.
To make sure you're catching those biases.
Yeah, it's like building checks and balances into the system.
It is.
So no one perspective is dominating. And you're constantly questioning those assumptions.
Exactly.
And challenging the status quo.
That's what it's all about.
And that's where I think Salkind's 4-step process comes in.
Oh, yeah.
For creating and using tests fairly.
Right.
Starting with recognizing our own biases, then getting feedback from, a variety of perspectives.
From diverse people, yeah.
And being willing to start over or get help if bias emerges.
Absolutely.
And remembering that test takers are individuals.
Yeah.
Not just members of groups.
That's so important.
It's a really holistic approach.
It is.
And it recognizes how complex this issue is.
Right.
This whole conversation's really made me think about the power of tests.
Yeah, me too.
And the responsibility we have to make sure they're used fairly.
It's a big responsibility. Yeah. Tests can be really powerful tools.
They can.
For measuring knowledge and skills.
Yeah.
Identifying areas for growth. Opening doors to opportunities.
Right.
But we have to be so careful about the potential for bias.
Yeah.
And really committed to creating assessments that are equitable.
Right.
And empowering for all learners.
It's about moving beyond just ranking students.
Yeah.
And sorting them. And really trying to understand what they know.
Yeah.
And how they learn best.
I love that.
That's a great way to put it.
It's about seeing assessments as a way to support students.
Yeah.
Not to control them.
To help them reach their full potential.
Exactly.
On that note, I think we've reached the end.
We have.
Of our deep dive into test bias and universal design.
That was great.
A huge thank you to our expert for sharing their insights.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope this deep dive has made you think critically.
Yeah.
About the role of testing in our world.
For sure.
Remember, every voice matters.
It does.
In this movement for educational equity.
Absolutely.
And together, we can create a world where assessments are fair.
Yeah.
And just for all.
That's the goal.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.